If you or someone you know has suffered from the meaning crisis, or from the belief that even if you do muster up enough courage to actually believe in something, there's no way to know if that something is true or to expect others to accept it as true, you may be entitled to financial compensation. And you can blame this guy, Immanuel Kant. While not a bad-intentioned guy, Kant attempted to answer some very big questions during his time, but in the process planted the seeds for ideas that would eventually grow into ideas like idealism, nihilism, and postmodernism, effectively eradicating any universal concept of meaning or truth. Let me explain. In the 18th century, philosophy faced a crisis. With modern thinking being officially ungrounded from dogmatism by the Reformation, the presumptions of basically all prior Western thought were under attack. A philosopher by the name of David Hume essentially put the philosophical thinkers of that time on skates and led the charge against the main epistemic categories of previous philosophical inquiry, namely causation, or the chain of events leading from one to another. He stated that causation was not actually a tangible category of reality, but instead was just a made-up mental habit in which man used to make sense of things. If Hume's accusations were true, it seemed as though reality really only could be verified through observation. And without a rational reliability on our understanding of causality being a real part of the way things work, man would question his ability to know anything which was not gained by first-hand perception, and in turn destroying the prospect of a faith in God. Yet, in response to Hume, Immanuel Kant enters the discussion presenting ideas that would change philosophy forever. While Kant attempts to save faith, he actually weakens it, and the collateral damage is the destruction of metaphysics, a death which we feel the sting of today in problems such as the meaning crisis. But before we can explain why one thing led to another, it's important to underline just why David Hume's empiricism was so devastating to faith and scholastic methods of reasoning. To Hume, causality as a reliable means to knowledge has a bullseye on its head, because it doesn't actually justify anything, because to him it's not an actual thing and therefore not in reason, but instead an attempt to fill in the blanks due to our lack of knowledge. For example, Hume states that we can't actually know that the sun will rise tomorrow just because it rose today and the day before. That doesn't give a good reason because it really isn't a reason at all. Instead, the claim that the sun will rise tomorrow needs to be grounded in observable scientific facts, such as the Earth's rotation, because that would be grounded in an experience of an actual tangible fact of reality. Okay, so what? That's just like your opinion, man. Well, not actually. The problem with this critique is that the category of causality is the foundation on which most methods of induction lay upon, such as Aquinas' 5 proofs for the existence of God, and this was the means by which most knowledge up until that point was gained. And during this time, there was no substantial responses to Hume's critique. In terms of induction, each argument relying on it depends on the assumption that causation is a real and objective feature of reality. If Hume successfully proves that causation is merely a subjective construct of the mind, then all methods of gaining knowledge through induction collapse. You might be saying, well, like that includes all philosophical thought up until that point. Exactly, which is why our boy Kant was in a bit of a tumult. And he had to do something. He respected the critiques of Hume and valued the precision of the empirical system of Newtonian physics, but refused to throw the baby out with the bathwater. He knew that there had to be a way in which to reconcile the transcendental truths of his faith, such as moral reasoning, metaphysical grounding, and the existence of God, with the seemingly empirical nature of modern epistemology. With these thoughts in mind, Kant created a system in which he could have his cake and eat it too. He created a divide or a barrier in reality that seemingly solved this problem. This barrier was known as the realm of the noumena and the phenomena. The noumena being the realm of absolute reality, where God, the soul, and other spiritual realities existed, in which human reason had an impasse. The phenomena was the reality of the subjective experience, in which the individual experiences the noumena but reconstructs reality according to the capabilities of his own mind. Kant proposes that the categories under attack, such as causation, space, time, etc., are not inherent realities but rather are a priori structures in which the mind packages experiences. To break this down, Kant is saying that the real world is like its own format of data. but the mind extracts that data and reformats it into a way in which only it can understand, in terms of causality, space, and time. But that said, because man's reason is limited to these structures, he is unable to experience reality as it truly is. But here's where it gets tricky. To Kant, the only way man can access absolute reality is through faith, by which his flawed reason vaguely points to the nature of absolute reality. Kant famously states in the Critique of Pure Reason, "I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." What Kant doesn't realize is that this is a double-edged sword. If we can't have knowledge but can only interpret experience in a way that has no correlation to absolute reality, whatever we put our faith in would inevitably be unreasonable, because a faulty system with unreliable results would be the reason for why we reached the conclusion which we did. And the whole system collapses in on itself, weakening faith rather than propping it up. And personally, this is something I just can't wrap my head around about these post-scholastic philosophers. They seem to all attack reason in order to free themselves from dogmatism, yet whatever efforts they take ultimately turn in against themselves because they discredit the very means to their end, thus invalidating the possibility of ever reaching the finish line. If the mind imposes its own structures on reality, creating its unique subjective form of reality, and just having faith that artificial reality somehow correlates to actual reality, then what basis does one have to make claims about objective reality whatsoever, including Kant's entire philosophical system? Kant's philosophy leaves us with three main things: a fragmentation of knowledge in which there is no correspondence between the things I think I know and the truth of reality, meaning the things I know aren't actually true and therefore I have no knowledge; a self-refutation of the noumenal realm. If our rational faculty can only lead us to a faulty faith in objective reality, how can we even know it exists? The marriage of these two concepts leaves us with their logical love child and the third consequence, which is that the only knowable reality is subjective reality, which is constructed entirely by one's own mind. In other words, idealism, which is the parasite deeply embedded within today's philosophical culture. Kant gave birth to the seed in which was watered by the logical conclusions of later thinkers like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. Fichte believing that reality is actually created by the conscious mind, in which it collects data from reality and collapses it into interpretable experiences. Schelling, however, takes another interpretation of Kant, by taking the notions of Kant's a priori structures as space, time, and causality as being purely subjective categories whose only function is to allow for distinction within human cognition, and therefore he removes them, because distinctions are just mental constructs and thus have no real ontology. But by doing this, Schelling moves towards a pantheistic view which holds that since all distinctions have no real ontology, they ultimately collapse and therefore all becomes one in a sort of monism. Hegel, also inspired by Kant, developed a dialectical system in which reality and knowledge are dynamic processes of development, culminating in the self-realization of the absolute spirit. Hegel saw Kant's work as a necessary step toward understanding that truth is not static, but unfolds historically through contradictions and their resolution. But these are just the more pleasant interpretations, as later on they get much more dark. The philosopher Schopenhauer accepted the premises of Kant and their conclusions, but saw how pointless and horrible they made life to be. Schopenhauer extended Kant's thought to say that the directing force of human experience was the will, but the will was directed by human reason, which was incapable of knowing the truth of things, and therefore unable to know what would fulfill it or lead it to happiness. And thus humanity was sentenced to aimlessly traverse the world with an irrational desire that would never lead it to happiness, and thus the only reality was suffering, because humans could only do what was bad because they couldn't figure out what was good. He didn't get many second dates. And from Schopenhauer we have Nietzsche, who just thought Kant was a coward. He thought that Kant found the truth behind human experience, but was too afraid to continue down the road leading to the inevitable death of God and thus meaning. He states in The Will to Power, they have taken the concept of truth far too seriously. Kant made it into a hangman's metaphysical truth. And this influence of Kant on Nietzsche led him to believe that there is no thing in itself, only interpretation shaped by human perspective and drives. There are no facts, only interpretation. Man must then make his own beauty and his own meaning. But if every meaning is subjective, what objective value does it have? And this leads to postmodern thinking. Naturally, if the only thing which exists is interpretation and narrative, it wouldn't be long until man figured out that the highest rule of the land was his own will, and that he could and should seek power above all, and justifying his will not with truth but with narrative. Nothing is right or wrong, but thinking makes it so. You don't have to look far to see the ravaging effect these beliefs have had on society, especially the youth. Human cognition works using frames of reference, and these references need to be grounded. Imagine trying to measure something in which the points being measured keep changing. It'd be impossible, eventually leading one to give up. That's where we are today. We've given up. People naturally desire meaning and value, and for these things to actually mean anything, we have to know truth. Yet, if the prospect of truth is impossible, the psyche is left with no grounds in which to function, resulting in insanity and saying things which are obviously untrue are true, or vice versa. While well-intentioned, and I didn't mean this to be a hit piece of Kant, but just to show how dangerous his ideas ended up being later down the line, paving the way for postmodernism, where truth is a construct of the mind, power is the only reality, and objective reality is an untenable illusion. But all is not lost. There is a way to reconcile Kant's transcendental idealism and ground our thinking in a way which allows us to access the truth with a capital T. And to find that way, you're going to have to give me some time to make a new video. Thanks for watching, and keep seeking the truth.